students rising up to protest a war, a BS rule change that no one was told about, and students getting plastered in a limo. All this and more in this video. What is your best "they can't send us all to detention" story? In 11th grade, my gym teacher had the high school change uniform rules so that none of the girls past grade 10 could wear shorts at all during PE, no matter the length. It wouldn't have been so frustrating if the teacher herself hadn't worn booty shorts and was never told to cover up because she was leading the married principal around by his dong. So all of us in my grade that had gym wore pants the next day but refused to do anything except sit on the floor the entire period. The principal was called and threatened us all with in-school suspension, but we kept sitting and ignored him. We repeated it for 2 more days before they let us wear shorts again. Another teacher had called the school board and the school board was like, just let them wear shorts. It's PE. It's lame, but it's all I got. Story 2. When I was in junior high school, probably about 1968 to 1970, female students were not allowed to wear jeans or pants of any type, skirts and dresses only. And this was public school. If you did try to wear pants, you would be sent home to change. One day, a large group of us decided to all wear pants and just see what happened. About 60 girls all wore slacks, not even jeans, but nice slacks to class, and they made us sit in the hallway until they figured out what to do. We had to sit in the school auditorium all day, but the whole thing started a dialogue with the school district. And the next year, we could wear pants to class. A year after that, we could wear jeans. Story 3. When I was in high school, a student walked up to the front of the class and pulled the clock off the wall and wound it forward 1 minute past when the bell typically would ring. The entire class watched him doing this and actively began distracting the teacher so she wouldn't notice. He goes back to his seat calmly and raises his hand. "Excuse me, Miss Spanish teacher?" "Yes." "Can we go now? I think I heard the bell." "Oh my goodness, everyone, go!" The entire class sprinted out the door and started booking it down the hallways and into the parking lot. The assistant principal took over the class for the rest of the week. Story 4. 3 minutes after the buzzer signaling the start of class, my biology teacher would lock the classroom door so that people who arrived late couldn't sneak in. If you arrived after the 3 minutes, you would have to wait in the corridor until he decided you had suffered enough shame. One day, we all turn up to class on time and the door is unlocked, so we go in and sit down. There is no sign of the teacher, so we wait. After 5 minutes, he is still not turned up, so someone decides to turn the tables. We all decided this would be hilarious, so one of the boys locks the door and we just sit around and chat. The teacher turns up a couple of minutes later and tries to get in, but cannot, and starts knocking on the door telling the boys to unlock it. They refuse, and he goes to the security office to get another key. The boys then unlock the door and the teacher returns. We were expecting him to get really pissed off, but fortunately he saw the funny side of it and laughed it off. He never locked the classroom door again. Story 5. Our temp teacher left the room to get something, and while she was out, someone locked the door. Eventually, the teacher gets back and finds that she didn't have the key, and no one inside the room will unlock the door for her. So she has to call the head of department to unlock it for her. Then the temp and the head of the department make all kinds of threats about what will happen if no one comes forward, but no one does. And that's how we found out they actually can put an entire class in detention. Story 6. At my high school, we had trailers way at the far end of campus that some classes were in. I had a math class in one of these trailers with a very strict and maybe a little insane teacher. As soon as the tardy bell rang, he locked the classroom door and wouldn't let anyone into his room without a tardy pass from the office. Anyway, one day this huge fight broke out on campus, which blocked one of the main exits that led to the trailers. Tardy bell rang before anyone in our class got to the trailer. We all waited until he opened his door, announced no one would be let in without a tardy pass, and sent the entire class to the office. When an entire class of kids walked into the office to explain what happened, they just rolled their eyes, and the vice principal walked us back to class and told our teacher that he had to let us in. Story 7. In high school, we had a big tradition of wearing costumes the Friday of Halloween. My senior year, they banned costumes and said any students found will get a detention. I said F it and went as my GTA 5 character, a cowboy with a thick Russian accent. By the way, I'm Russian and live in rural US. A friend went as Marty McFly. Long story short, everyone went with normal clothes as costumes. List of outfits: an axe murderer, a fighter pilot, a greaser, a doo-wop girl with the greaser, a motorcycle rider, a gangsta, some character from American Horror Story, Jason Brody with a tattoo, and more. Nobody got a detention. One asshole teacher tried, but we argued this is what we always wear. It was true for Marty McFly. Edit. Also forgot when half the class would do arm farts. The desks were set up in a C pattern, and when the teacher had his back turned, one kid would do it, and when another would do it on the other side. We all missed lunch. Story 8. Last day in 8th grade before moving to another school 2 hours away. Had tater tots for lunch. A friend said something, so I tossed a ketchup-covered tater tot onto his tray. He said, "Food fight," and tossed it back. I threw it at his face. Someone else joined in. Pretty soon, 50-some kids were tossing tater tots. Big ass food fight. It all got blamed on me because I was leaving. When I got to my new school, they'd been told, and the second day there, I was called into the principal's office where I was threatened with a suspension if anything like that happened there. Story 9. March 20th, 2003. I was a foreign exchange student in Germany as a 7th grader. Germany as a whole was extremely against Bush starting a war with Iraq, so in early March, it started to circulate the school that if the war would in fact start, everyone would walk out in protest. March 20th came and the 11th and 12th graders sounded the alarm. The entire school streamed out in a gigantic mob. They tried to lock us in, but it turns out that you can't really prevent 500 kids/teenagers from going somewhere. So doors were forcibly held open, and people jumped from the first-story windows. Everyone took the public transportation to the middle of the city, where our school met up with 3 other school bodies and we marched through the streets. I remember my class was supposed to have music that day, so we all got our recorders out and blew them as loudly and off-key as possible. As the American foreign exchange student, it was definitely a bit awkward to be ditching school to protest my own country. But I definitely didn't want to make myself a social outcast by being one of the only ones to stay behind, and I was also personally against the war. So I got over that pretty quickly and enjoyed the adventure and a day without classes. The protest was over 2 or 3 hours later, and everyone just went home, even though school was long from over. The next day, a few teachers gave us lectures, but that was the extent of it. Who knows, maybe the instigators got bigger punishments, but us little 7th graders were left alone. That was the first time in my life that I ever protested something, and it was honestly extremely empowering, even as a foreign exchange student protesting my own country. Story 10. In my senior year of high school, I and another kid got sent to discipline for roughhousing in PE class. I was sent home for the day and assumed the same thing happened to the other kid. Skipped school the next day for an extracurricular event, and when I came back the following day, I was called in for a disciplinary meeting. Apparently, they gave the other kid a 3-day suspension, so the following day, the rest of the PE class decided to march into the administration offices and protest over the unfair punishment of the other guy. So the principal decided I skipped school because I knew about the protest, so I got punished again. Kudos to the other 50-plus kids that somehow got away with it. Forced the school to enforce an even stupider policy of punishing someone getting beaten up equally to the kid doing the beating. Story 11. Once, my high school decided I was to blame for a similar protest of something that had to do with our National Honor Society. I totally was, but had very carefully made sure I didn't break any rules. They couldn't tell me any rules I broke, but were still upset, so they told me I had to go to detention. I said no, and just went to class instead. The teacher told me to go to detention. I said no, so she shrugged and went on teaching. The principal showed up and told me to go to detention, so I asked why. She couldn't come up with any rules I'd broken, so I said no. She left. They called my mom and said I had to go to detention. She said no, so they hung up. I never heard anything about it after that. But then there was a new rule saying no deviating from the teacher-approved script at school events. Story 12. I had a math class in high school which was taught by the department chair, Mr. Smith. Now, this guy was absolutely adamant about the no phones policy. Once while he was teaching, he heard someone's phone vibrate and said that whoever's phone it was, they needed to bring it up and speak to him after class. When nobody moved, he said, "Okay, all of you have detention tomorrow morning." We complained to our parents that night. Parents complained to the school. School dropped us all from attention. The asshole teacher was still there for another year, but that's mostly because he was the varsity football coach. Story 13. Back in high school, most of us had just started to drive to school. We had an assembly which no one was bothered to go to, so a lot of us who had brought cars to school decided to do a mass sneak out for an hour, how long the assembly was supposed to be. Turns out so many people were missing that they actually did a head count of who was there and who was not. Half the grade got detention, but it was worth it. Story 14. We had been to Berlin in 11th grade. During this trip, we drank a lot of alcohol. It was strictly forbidden, but we always managed to drink without the teachers noticing it. Then there was the final day. We drank much more compared to the previous days, and we didn't care much about the teachers' opinions. The party was over at 11 p.m. after the teachers have found half the class in one room. The room smelled of weed, so the police was called in. In addition, one guy was brought to the hospital. No one except for the guy landing in the hospital was punished for it because everyone was involved. Story 15. At 15, I discovered the greatest implement of mischief I could bring to school was a Phillips head screwdriver. After spending a productive morning taking the screws out of everything I could find, notice boards, toilet cubicles, etc., I decided it was time to move up to dismantling the desks. There was one kid always the last in a class, so I duly whipped out all the screws holding his desk together, leaving them hanging by just a hair, half a thread, just enough to stop it collapsing under its own weight. Teacher is already there. In he comes and crashes to the ground in a pile of metal and timber. Mass hilarity ensues. Happy with the income and with the support of all my peers, I spent my lunch break doing all the desks in the room we'd be in for the next class. Teacher comes in, sits down. I left hers alone. We all file in straight-faced and all come crashing down. She seemed to not be too fazed by the Monty Python-like scene unfolding in front of her. People shouting indignantly, "This place is falling apart," etc. Gave us 15 minutes to sort this mess out, and having checked her own chair for structural rigidity, carried on with the class, but kept us back 15 minutes to make up for lost time. Story 16. Normal reporting time was 7, but on every Thursday there would be a free block/study block for the first 2 hours of school. This was the case for everyone. The school policy was that on Thursday you just had to mark your attendance by 9, which was done by scanning a card. Then the loco discipline mistress quietly changed that rule on some semi-hidden corner of the permanently glitchy school website with no announcements made to the school. Now the secret rule was that you had to show up by 7 on Thursdays like any other day. Anyway, that Thursday came and like half the school ended up being 2 hours late. That's more than 200 people. Everyone was thinking, well, this can't mean jack. What are they going to do, send all 200 of us to detention? Logistically, they couldn't. So they did something way crazier. They gave half the school a mark on the permanent record. For context, you usually have to be late a few times to get a warning, and then late a few times more to get detention, then get a detention a few times to get a permanent mark. That day, this discipline mistress decided, nope, half the school will get a permanent mark, even if it's their first offense. Story 17. Somewhat relevant. In 7th grade, we had an old teacher that everyone hated. She constantly talked down to students, called us stupid, and half-assed her lessons. One day, we all show up to class and she tells us to turn in our homework that she assigned us. And if we didn't, we would get an automatic Saturday school. Kind of like detention, but you come in on Saturday and pretty much sit in a room doing nothing for 4 hours. The problem was, she never gave us the worksheet that we were supposed to do. Never even mentioned it. So, obviously, nobody in our class did it. Not even the straight A students. So she gave everyone in our class Saturday school, despite us all telling her she never assigned anything. She didn't believe us and was convinced we were all lying to mess with her. We were all upset that we had come to school on a Saturday, and it felt extremely unfair. Some kids even went to the principal to complain, but nothing came of it. The next day, we were all told by our vice principal that our punishment was rescinded because not a single student of hers in any of her classes had done the assignment. She was convinced that all 120 plus of her students, spread across 8 classes, had somehow gotten together and decided not to do the assignment to mess with her. She did learn, though, that you can't give literally everyone detention. Story 18. In middle school English, my friends and I were the jokesters in the class. Anytime we were given an opportunity to perform a skit or record a video, we were writing jokes and laying the class out with laughter. One day, we were tasked with writing a very somber skit. Portray the sad story of a poverty-stricken family on Thanksgiving Day, the same day they lose a loved one to an automobile accident. The only requirement was it could not be a comedy. The teacher looked directly at us. If you attempt to make this comedic sketch about this awful story, you will receive a 0 on this assignment. This assignment was worth 50 points. Immediately after, the teacher proceeded to announce an optional extra credit essay worth 50 points. My teammates and I all exchanged a skeptical glance. It was like she was daring us. We collectively said, F it, and we wrote the funniest goddamn sketch about poor people you've ever seen. Halfway through our delivery, the teacher rose to stop us and had to lean against the desk to catch her breath from laughing too hard. She finally interrupted us and informed us we would receive a 0 on the assignment. We took that opportunity to hand in our extra credit essays for a sum total of 0 consequences whatsoever. Story 19. In college, there was a public speaking class that was a mandatory gen ed class, with a final that was 10% of your grade. At the same time, there was a rule that nobody could exempt the final exam. However, there were a few other issues. 1. You had to provide your own Scantron for the final. 2. To prevent cheating, there was a policy that no more tests would be issued after the first one was turned in. 3. The university had no plus or minus on the grades. I had a 100 average going into the final. Since a 10% drop wouldn't stop me from getting an A in the course, I pre-filled in my Scantron with random answers, mostly A and B. Sat down, got my exam, and handed it in before they could finish handing out the exams to the rest of the auditorium, about 350 other students. At first, there was about to be a riot because according to all the rules, nobody was allowed to take the test. At the same time, the professors knew they couldn't just give everyone a 0 on the final without opening a Pandora's box of grade disputes. End result? Everybody exempted the exam. Story 20. Oh, they could, and they did. My high school had a pretty bogus tardy policy my sophomore year. If you weren't inside the classroom when the bell rang, you had to go up to the office to call your parents and sign up for an ISS date. My school was fairly large, multi-story with basement classes and trailers outside. That meant quite a few poor souls were habitually up to 2 minutes late due to distance and hall traffic. This policy was greatly disliked by both parents and students. It caused parents to have to take time out of work to receive phone calls from school and led to lost class time for the students. It was only in place a week, when almost half the school was in ISS at least 1 day a week for the next 3 weeks. The next week was even worse, with students purposefully being tardy to overfill the ISS room to the point where they had to put out tables in the atrium and hallways, so the 2 poor ISS teachers could see them all. This went on for the entirety of the school year. By winter break, the teachers were fed up with having empty classrooms and having to bring so much work each morning to the ISS teachers to distribute. I managed to rack up 3 straight weeks of ISS days in 2 days. Just because I was tired of running through from the trailers on one side of the school at the basement level up to the second floor on the opposite side of the school twice a day, and because I just wanted to sit in silence in ISS. The pushback from parents and teachers was amazing, but the school held firm to their policy. But by the end of the year, they announced there would be a new tardy policy in place for next year. We won the war, but we didn't win a single battle, and a few kids ended up being stuck a grade behind because of all the missed class time affecting their grades. Story 21. I've posted this before and no one believed me, but here it goes again. For my sister's last week of high school, they decided to do a food fight. She had some friends come over and they spent $200 on food, mostly spaghetti, and took it to school and passed it out to like 10 of her friends. She came and sat next to me at the table and was talking, and I was like, "So when are you gonna throw it?" She said, "Now," and just sent it flying. All of her friends started throwing it, and the whole cafeteria broke out into a huge food fight, like the one you'd actually see in a movie. After a few minutes, the principal came in and broke it up. He walked up to my sister and lifted her up by the arm and then drug her out. He came back in a few minutes later and was standing by the trash can. One of my good friends was dating her at the time and got pissed when the principal grabbed her. So he asked everyone for their food at the table and loaded it onto his tray. He then went through the line and got a bunch of extra stuff loaded onto his plate and just dumped all of the dressing on the tray. He went and stood next to the principal, and the principal looked at him and said, "Are you gonna eat that?" To which my buddy said, "No, you are," and slammed the loaded tray into his face, covering him in food. The whole cafeteria stood up and started cheering. Story 22. I had just started studying in an international school on the East Coast. Being 16 and European, I was quite used to drinking, much against national, state, and school policy. A bunch of students arranged a limo party, aka driving around getting drunk in a limo for a few hours. This seemed like a good way to get drunk and not get busted. However, if you gather about 15 to 20 international students, Scandinavian and South American for the most part, who barely know each other, stuff is gonna go down. People drank like there was no tomorrow. Everyone was making out, and the Mexicans had brought their home-brewed tequila. People proceeded to get plastered, causing a scene, yelling out of the roof of the limo, and eventually a police chase happened. The limo driver, knowing he had provided booze to a bunch of minors, drove us all back to the school as fast as a limo can go, threw us all out, and drove off. A girl had to get pumped out, and we were all super messed up as the school was about to kick us out. We'd been there a month, and we were all scared. The school somehow convinced the police they would be in charge of the punishment, and we all got a bunch of detention, community service, and a course in the dangers of alcohol. My parents had paid a fortune for me to attend this school, and being middle class, I can't believe how dumb I was to risk it all for 5 drunk hours in a limo. Thankfully, the school didn't want the bad rep, so only the Mexicans got kicked out. Story 23. 8th grade algebra advanced class. We had these massive 2-inch thick hardcover textbooks. So we used to organize random book drops. Those of us taking Spanish, language classes were always right before math, used to agree on a time and quietly alert the guys who took French. Then, when the appointed time came around, everyone would shove their textbooks off the desk at the same time and make an almighty bang. Of course, people would start laughing and doing it at random, so you'd get a series of random loud bangs after one first massive one. Our teacher was great, though. Even though we did this about every 4 to 6 weeks, he never yelled or put us in detention. I think he just accepted it as a hazard of teaching an advanced class of kids in a public school. Story 24. Last semester, we had this awful math teacher. refused to teach the traditional way and instead taught with videos you watch at home. The videos were made by him, and unfortunately the mic was barely audible. Nice guy and all, and super smart, but still. After protests from the class that the videos didn't work, we decided to riot. So at the end of class, he would show the answers to the questions we had. He did this with a projector and an overhead. A friend downloaded a universal remote app on his phone. For the next 2 weeks, we had our teacher paranoid that the classroom had bad wiring and was dangerous. We would flick the projector on and off, and at one time the lights just turned out. Wasn't us, but it helped our case. When they figured out what was happening, I thought for sure someone would sell the kid out, but everyone stayed silent. Story 25. I was taking videography, drawing flip books and filming them in 8th grade, and my teacher was a handful, but I guess we could be too. At the beginning of every class, she would make us sign out Sharpies to do our flip books with. One day, right before class ended, she started counting her Sharpies and one was missing. She started ranting and raving on how one of us must have stolen it and how we most likely were going to vandalize something during lunch. She had the damn Sharpie tucked behind her ear. We all saw this, but thought it was kind of funny to watch her flip out. No one said a word until we had been held for 15 minutes, with her berating us and treating us like criminals. When she was told, she didn't even apologize. She actually insinuated that somehow it was still our fault. So at lunch, my friends and I hatched a plan. The next day, everyone would walk out 15 minutes early to lunch. Amazingly, we got everyone to agree without tipping off the teacher. And 15 till the end of the period, we all stood up at once and quietly left. She was furious. I remember walking past the administration office a few minutes later and hearing the principal tell her, "You can't suspend your whole class." I just chuckled. Story 26. At my old high school, there was a collection of mobile buildings used for languages, French, German, etc. And coincidentally, all of my year group were being taught in this group of mobiles at the same time one afternoon. So I'm in my German class, and our teacher decides for the last 10 minutes we would be allowed to watch a football match. This was during the World Cup, and it was the match which would decide if England could go through to the final, so it was a big deal. When he couldn't get his laptop working, he asked 2 kids to go to another mobile to see if they had gotten the football on. They never came back. He sent 2 more kids. They didn't come back either. Eventually, there were 3 kids left in the classroom, including myself. My teacher has finally gotten the football up, so asks me to go get the rest of the class back in. When I got outside, near every kid was there running around screaming. One kid had ripped a wooden board from the steps and was swinging it wildly. 2 kids were making out on the floor. In the middle of it all stood the headmaster, trying his best to yell at the kids, but getting nowhere. Several teachers were crying. We had a system where if a teacher couldn't cope, they could call emergency support. Unfortunately, on this day, emergency support was required for the emergency support team, and eventually there was no one left to help. I went back into the mobile and told my teacher what happened. He put his head in his hands, and I never attended another German class. No kids were ever caught or given detention because there were just too many of them. Oh man, great times.